My name is Nina Rifkind. I am here on behalf of the Jewish Federation of Oxford, and I wanted to thank the Center for the Study of Southern Jewish Culture, Afton, Thomas, and Katie McKee, and everyone else who was involved in putting this together. Thank you all for making this happen today. I'm very excited. Before I introduce Professor Rabin, I just want to say a quick word about how this came about. It may be a bit personal, but when I first moved to Oxford 18 years ago, I knew very little about the South and even less about its Jewish history. I carried with me my own biases and provincial perceptions of what it meant to be a Jewish American, but I soon came to realize that the South's Jewish past and present are much more rich and complex than I had thought. And when through my work with the Jewish Federation of Oxford, I started looking into speakers to help us learn more about our collective Southern and Jewish past, all paths led me to Professor Rabin. So I am really excited to have her here today. Shari Rabin is an associate professor of Jewish studies and religion and chair of Jewish studies at Oberlin College. She's the author of Jews on the Frontier, Religion and Mobility in 19th-century America, which won the National Jewish Book Award in American Jewish Studies. She is currently at work on a history of Jews, religion, and race in the US South from the 17th century to the present day. I just want to show you all her first book, which is beautiful and out and available for purchase in the lobby. So I hope you all will like to do that. In the meantime, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Rabin.
Thank you so much to everybody who organized this visit and to all of you for coming. It's really such a pleasure to be here. I was thrilled to get the invite, and it's wonderful to finally be here. So I should get the mic a little bit closer to me. There we go. So I want to start with a document that I've been a little bit obsessed with for probably 7 or 8 years. It's called the Fundamental Constitutions of Carolina. Anybody heard of it? No, that's okay. It's a fascinating document. It was co-authored by a young John Locke, yes, that John Locke, in 1669, and it laid out in punctilious detail a utopian plan for a new colony in England's North American territory. The document was frequently revised and never fully implemented, but it was widely circulated as an advertisement for potential immigrants. It envisioned an orderly, balanced, and hierarchical society run by a hereditary nobility under the authority of the king and the Church of England. It also, very intriguingly, granted permission to Jews, heathens, and other dissenters from the purity of the Christian religion to create a church or profession. In French Louisiana, by contrast, the very first article of the 1724 Code Noir required the colony's directors and officers to drive out of said country all Jews who may have established their residence there. It described Jews as declared enemies of the Christian name. Adapted from codes used to govern French holdings in the Caribbean, the Code Noir forbade all religions other than Catholicism, but still Jews were number one. Very first item, no Jews. The third example I want to talk about briefly is Georgia, which was founded as a military buffer and a charitable sanctuary for impoverished Englishmen and persecuted European Protestants. Its charter offered liberty of conscience in the worship of God to all persons except papists, which does not allow in Catholics, but still would seem, it would logically follow that Jews might be included as part of that. And so a group of Jews from London sent a sort of shipment of Jews to this new colony. And yet when word got out that they were on their way, the trustees complained that the inclusion of Jews was contrary to the intentions of the trustees and potentially of ill consequences to the colony. Nevertheless, by the time that message got there, the Jews had already arrived to a community in the midst of a vicious epidemic, and one of the Jewish settlers was a physician who treated everybody. So they stayed. So a little bit of background for this history, and part of what is so kind of striking about it in the broader expanse of Jewish history is that Jews had been expelled from England in 1290, from France in 1394, as well as from Spain and Portugal in the 1490s, a sort of catastrophic expulsion that dramatically propelled Jews all over the world, to the Ottoman Empire, to the Netherlands, to Italy, and to the Americas. So there's this history of expulsion. And yet, as these European empires are beginning to colonize the Americas, including the lands that would come to be understood as the American South, among the questions that they faced was this question of what to do about the Jews. They were imagined as part of the Carolina colony before they, or really any Europeans, had even arrived there, which is really, it's striking. I've looked around, and to my knowledge, it seems that Carolina has the only founding document from an English colony that mentions the possibility of Jewish settlement explicitly. As we saw in the French Catholic context, they were imagined. Possibility of Jews was, top of mind, but very pointedly excluded. And in Georgia, the precarity of the colonial endeavor enabled Jews to claim a place despite their implicit exclusion. By the middle of the 18th century, Jews would be present in all three locations, albeit in sometimes unexpected ways. Now, with the partial exception of Savannah, this history is relatively unknown, even in American Jewish historical scholarship. New Amsterdam gets a lot more attention because a group of Jews arrived there from Brazil in 1654, which is 15 years before the fundamental constitutions of Carolina. It's also 10 years before the English renamed the city New York, right? So for obvious reasons having to do with the contemporary sort of place of New York in national histories and in the Jewish world more generally, New Amsterdam gets more attention, right? It leads to this massive, what is now a massive Jewish metropolis, and it's earlier. In recent years, there's also been an explosion of scholarship on what historians call the Jewish Atlantic world, which kind of zooms out from the 13 colonies to consider the experiences that Jews shared, especially Spanish and Portuguese Jews who had been expelled, or who converted to Catholicism, and then several generations later kind of re-emerged as Jews. So this Atlantic world scholarship looks at their shared experience of those Jews who moved and communicated between London, Amsterdam, and the Americas, especially places in the Caribbean. That scholarship, right, which it zooms out, so it's not so focused on the 13 colonies, but it tends to assume anyways, without necessarily looking too closely, that the southern mainland colonies that I was just talking about fit relatively unproblematically into their vision of a shared cultural world among Spanish and Portuguese Jews. So the lands that would become the South were colonized relatively late compared to the northern mainland colonies and the Caribbean. They also featured a different mix of imperial powers, and they had smaller communities of Jews, and so for those reasons, they've attracted less attention. In Southern history, Jews don't get a lot of attention, period, let alone in this early history. To be sure, there are reasons for this as well. Jews were never more than a tiny minority of the region's population. They mostly dwelled in its cities and towns rather than the iconic rural spaces that you would automatically think about. And not only were they not Christian, as were the majority of the people around them, but they also differed from the majority in ways that went beyond belief and worship alone. Jews were embedded within a system of religious law and a transnational community, which together encouraged exclusive kinship ties and a mercantile economic profile. So there were things about Jews as a community that looked different from just going to a different church. These idiosyncrasies, though, need not disqualify the South from consideration in Jewish history or Jews from inclusion in Southern history. Indeed, I think that exploring Jews in the early South, both as a political question and as kind of an actual presence, sheds important light on broader questions of place and governance, race and religion. In particular, it highlights linkages between religion and power, Christianity and whiteness that begin here in the colonial period but long outlast it. I'm now going to tease out more of this history Drawing from the earliest chapters of my forthcoming book, which Nina mentioned, it's a narrative survey of Southern Jewish history that will be published by Princeton University Press, hopefully in early 2025. I haven't submitted the final draft, so there's still time to tinker before it goes into production. And I'm going to focus now especially on Carolina, which I began with, an English colony that offered Jews tremendous promise and which fostered a gradual and continuous Jewish community that ends up looking much more similar to later Southern Jewish communities than what we see in Georgia or Louisiana. I'm going to discuss the status of Jews in Carolina and the Jewish religious life that developed there. Charleston's 18th century Jews did not leave behind a huge documentary record, but together we're going to look at a couple of the remaining scraps and kind of dig into them closely and see what they can tell us. So the same 1654 migration that sent some Jews to Dutch New Amsterdam had sent others to English Barbados. And in the years that followed that migration, there was in England proper a debate about the question of readmission, right? Since the Jews had been expelled since 1290, now in the 1650s, there was a public debate held at the behest of Oliver Cromwell to discuss should Jews be allowed to settle in England. The result was kind of a tacit permission being granted, but not officially. They didn't put out the welcome sign. It was sort of subtle, but still significant. These developments, this gradual sort of admission of Jews to English territories, was shaped by a number of things, by a broader reorientation of English ideas about human difference, shaped in part by the Protestant Reformation and kind of religious dynamics within England, and also by England's growing imperial ambitions. In the Americas, especially, what we start to see in these years is the centuries-old distinction between Christians and Jews being reshaped by this new context, by the brutal system of labor that distinguished freedom from enslavement and eventually black from white, and the imperial competition over territory that brought Protestant England and Holland, Catholic France and Spain, and diverse native societies into contact, competition, and collaboration. And so in that context, Jews first had mercantile skills for a number of reasons, but partially their transnational ties, partially the limitations on Jewish economic activity in Europe for many centuries. They were also European in places where there were native populations and growing numbers of African-descended peoples. And they also really hated Spain, as did the English. So they had a number of things to recommend themselves as potential settlers in English territories. So to go back to the title of my talk in the first slide that I had up. So I first heard the phrase Jews, heathens, and other dissenters when I was living in Charleston from the volunteer Jewish docents as they took tourists around the city's historic synagogue and Jewish cemetery. And they used it as proof of the city's exceptional history of toleration on the one hand, and on the other hand, it was something of a laugh line, right? Like, it sounds a little bit silly. In truth, however, as I found, once I heard this phrase a number of times, it stood out to me, and I thought, like, I should go read the original document and find out what actually is happening there. And what I found is that both this phrase and the promise that it was attached to, of freedom of worship, was much more complicated than they initially seem. So first of all, the toleration was premised on the idea that non-Anglican groups may be won over to embrace and unfeignedly receive the truth of the Church of England. So the goal was not, toleration for all, embrace of diversity. No, the goal was ultimately to kind of use a carrot rather than a stick to convince people to become Anglican. So the goal was actually to eliminate religious difference. Second, the line appears in section 97, which begins by dividing those outside of the Church of England into two categories. So I've kind of divided it here so you can see. So first we have the natives of this place who are utterly strangers to Christianity, whose idolatry, ignorance, or mistake gives us no right to expel or use them ill. So these are so-called heathens who receive this kind of negative form of toleration, right? Well, I guess we shouldn't treat them badly. So these were referred to heathens, especially Native Americans, but also enslaved Africans, whom the Europeans were in the process of displacing and bringing to their colonies. As the historian Catherine Jin Lum has shown in her remarkable recent book, Heathen, this category of heathen was a religious category that was really, really central to Christian ideas about human difference, the Christian-heathen kind of divide, and ultimately ended up contributing in many ways to the development of race as a category. So that's category number one. Second are those who remove from other parts to plant there, who will unavoidably be of different opinions concerning matters of religion. And this points to the dissenters, who will positively expect to have liberty allowed them. These dissenters included the many non-Anglican denominations that flourished in the aftermath of the Protestant Reformation, and who had become the subject of varying efforts to expand Christian toleration. So your Baptists, your Presbyterians, your Quakers, and the like. So then we have the Jews, heathens, and other dissenters. So Jews are clearly not natives of the place, but their explicit mention later in the paragraph makes it unclear whether they are in fact considered to be part of this, those of different opinions or dissenters. This language suggests that they constitute somewhat of a third category outside of the established Anglican Church. And indeed, if you look at earlier writings by John Locke, he had distinguished Jews and other non-Christians from Christian dissenters. So Jewish worship was to be tolerated, but the nature and degree of their difference was left unclear, and ultimately the goal was to eliminate the difference altogether. The third thing to know about the fundamental constitutions of Carolina, and to help contextualize this phrase, is that religion in the document is defined very narrowly as belief in worship. So we see this here, the reference to opinions. Elsewhere in the document, colonists are required to believe in God and to attend some kind of public worship. They're forbidden from persecuting others for their speculative opinions in religion or other ways of worship. And at the very same time, religion is being disentangled from civil status in order to keep enslaved people in their place. So probably the most notorious line in this document says, "Every freeman of Carolina shall have absolute power and authority over his Negro slaves of what opinion or religion soever." So originally, when a Christian-Jewish binary was was primary, Christians could not be enslaved. But as historians have shown very convincingly in Virginia and in Barbados, gradually, Christian was replaced with white in documents regarding free status in order to exclude growing numbers of non-European Christians. And there's actually documents where Christian is crossed out and white is written above it. Elsewhere in the fundamental constitutions, it kind of reinforces this point. It says that religious affiliation would not affect any man's civil estate or right. So they're carefully delimiting the sphere of religion in ways that would allow for disagreements among Europeans, including, kind of surprisingly, Jews, while reinforcing racial inequality. So these moves that kept non-white peoples as unfree heathens, in a sense, even if they had converted to Christianity, it was not going to grant them freedom. That move also ended up turning Jews into tolerable white dissenters. So religious toleration was very limited, and it came with some real costs. This ambivalence about how to position Jews persisted after the founding of Charlestown in 1670, later to be renamed Charleston. If you've been to Charleston, now it's like America's best city to visit for the 10th year in a row or something, and it's on a peninsula, which is now filled with historic homes from the 19th century. But it began in 1670 with this small settlement on the eastern part of the peninsula. So within the colony that grew on this territory, Jews became kind of fully enmeshed as fellow white settlers. Already in the 1690s, we find the governor using a Spanish-speaking Jew for an interpreter in negotiations with the Yamasee, a number of Mississippian groups in the region. There's a document that shows one Jew selling a man named Dick to another Jew. And we also have a small group of Jews requesting naturalization alongside local French Protestants. The colonial legislature granted them this privilege as part of an act for making aliens free of this part of this province and granting liberty of conscience to all Protestants. Indeed, their inclusion basically required a status as de facto Protestant dissenters, which is essentially what you see here, right? They have to think of them as Protestant dissenters in order to enable their inclusion. Not all Christians in Charleston were on board with that, however. So in 1704, there's a conflict brewing between dissenting Protestants and the sort of Anglicans who are trying to formally establish the church as the official church of the colony. And they start raising questions about the legitimacy of the governing assembly. And in kind of raising those questions, they complain that all sorts of people, even aliens, Jews, servants, common sailors, and Negroes were admitted to vote at elections. So in trying to recover their own rights, these Protestant dissenters carve out a conception of political belonging that excluded Jews and classed them with this range of communal outsiders, based on occupation, based on race, based on socioeconomic status, and the like. So in other words, here they're figured as something closer to heathens. Dynamics played out somewhat similarly in English Savannah, which is different for a number of reasons, including the fact that it was initially marked by the intentional absence of slavery, although then later the enthusiastic embrace of slavery. Jews in Savannah as well were white settlers, although there too periodically their belonging was questioned, including by dissenting Protestants who had beef with the Anglicans. Savannah's Jews had founded a congregation in 1735, which they named Mikveh Israel, or Hope of Israel. This name was very, very similar to those adopted by congregations elsewhere in the Americas. You get Remnant of Israel, Dispersed of Israel. There are other Mikveh Israels. The name expressed their yearnings for messianic redemption. It drew from prophetic texts, and it centered the people of Israel. After a hopeful beginning, though, most of Savannah's Jews fled after just 5 years when England broke out in a war with Spain. Basically, the only Jews to remain in Savannah were the ones who didn't have family histories that had gone through Iberia. The congregation was only reestablished in the 1770s. So the Charleston and Savannah actually have kind of a rivalry over which Jewish community is older. And I guess I'm siding with Charleston because Savannah basically has this big gap in the middle of the 18th century when a lot of their people, in fact, moved to Charleston. In New Orleans, there was, in fact, a smattering of Jews by 1759, but it was only because French officials kind of looked the other way. In the Catholic city, enslaved people were required to be baptized, and public Jewish life was forbidden, even in burial. And there is records of at least one Jewish person who lived in French Louisiana being buried as a Catholic. There was no other possibility conceivable. 10 years later, New Orleans was back under Spanish rule, and a group of Jews was actually expelled on account of the nature of their business and of the religion they professed. A congregation wouldn't be established there until 1828, by which point Louisiana had been under American rule for several decades. So religious life in these places, in Savannah and in New Orleans, although in some ways Atlantic, part of this kind of broader Jewish experience, was also profoundly shaped by both local and imperial contexts. In Charleston, a congregation was finally established in 1749. So in 1669, they were told that they could gather to worship, but they didn't actually do it for quite a while, not till 1749. And following the lead of the other Atlantic congregations, they chose to follow the Spanish and Portuguese custom as observed by the congregations of London and Amsterdam. And yet, when it came to a name, they went in a much different direction than had Savannah and even New York, Bridgetown, these other communities that had these messianic names, right? There you see Mikveh Israel, Shereth Israel, Nidche Israel. And the Jews of Charleston named their congregation Kahal Kadosh Beth Elohim, Holy Congregation, House of God. No records remain from the era to explain the choice of name, but it comes from Genesis 28:17, where it describes the site of Jacob's ladder in Beersheba, which the medieval French commentator Rashi noted was located in the south. The second half of the verse that it appears in refers to Shari Shamayim, or the gates of heaven, which was the name of congregations in Jamaica and in London. So Charleston's Jews, with this name, not having any other information, we can at least see from the context that they were likely linking themselves in the south of Britain's North American colonies to London and the Iberian Peninsula, as well as to Jerusalem and even to heaven itself. At the same time, I think the name really suggests a feeling of attachment to the place where they have chosen to erect their house of God, right? It's a name that evokes a sense of place. Here's the Anglican church that was established in Charleston, which was built in the 1720s. And so after the founding of the congregation, 2 years after, a man named Jacob Oliveira dictated his last will and testament, which today is accessible on Ancestry.com. They have documents going all the way back to the 17th and 18th century. It's really remarkable. Presumably, it was members of the congregation who took care of his burial, but it's unclear whether he was a founder of the congregation. The congregation's first history was published in 1843, and it does mention his will's executors and his son-in-law as members of the congregation. And in facing his own mortality, Oliveira channeled the tradition of a Jewish ethical will, which offers guidance to those left behind. I recommend to my son to walk in the fear of God and in the path of virtue, which is the last and best legacy I can leave him. Oliveira also left his son David a more concrete legacy, namely household furniture, one half of his financial assets, and my Negro boy named Jones. His will expressed familial and ties and communal ones across the Atlantic and within Charleston. He left 10 pounds to the Portuguese Synagogue of London in exchange for the recitation of memorial prayers in his honor, and also an additional 10 pounds to each male Jew that should have a hand in washing or burying my body, according to the Jewish rite and customs. A third thing that Oliveira did in this will, which is a fascinating document, is to communicate directly with the divine. He requested God's most gracious pardon and divine mercy, and commanded my soul to him after death. He referred to past sins and transgressions, and asked my Creator to receive my soul with pity on my fragile nature. His God is an omnipotent Jewish God who determines human destinies, and whose followers might appeal to him through personal petitions and through communal prayers, right? He's paying Jews in London to pray for his soul after his death. It's unclear whether his own life had been one of sustained piety, or whether what we see here was kind of the result of a late in life reversal, deathbed conversion. His will also, though, very interestingly, included the Shema prayer, kind of the central prayer in many Jewish communities. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one, as well as a selection from Psalm 31, as he translated it, in thy hands I will enlist my spirit, thou hast rescued me, O Lord God of truth. While Jews throughout the world included religious preambles, burial clauses, and bequests of human beings, so much of his will is kind of representative of Jewish wills in other places. It's also somewhat distinct, and a scholar named Stanley Mervis has done an extensive study of Jewish wills in Jamaica, and he did not find this kind of the inclusion of specific prayers, the Shema and Psalm 31, those seem to be unusual. In making his final wishes known, then, Oliveira expressed anxiety about the fate of his material possessions, his body, and his soul, which he understood to be at the mercy of a providential God. So how do we explain what's going on here? Here's one answer. There's others, but here's one answer. In and beyond Charleston, the 1740s had been a time of really vigorous debate about the nature of God and religious authority more generally. The Church of England relied on state power, and yet it had a number of competitors. There were the dissenting groups that we talked about before. There is what one report described as irreligion, deism, and a licentious ridiculing of Holy Scriptures. So there was people who were uninterested in religion altogether. And there was also a growing evangelical movement inaugurated by what many historians call the Great Awakening. This was a dramatic transatlantic revival led by a man named George Whitefield, an Anglican minister who nonetheless criticized his colleagues, insisting on a present personal God who determined individual salvation and required experiences of conversion. Whitefield's theological vision and approach to religious authority offered pathways for the inclusion of the uneducated, of women, and even of enslaved people, which was particularly unnerving for many white Carolinians. In 1739, a group of enslaved Africans had revolted near the Stono River in South Carolina, killing 21 English settlers and terrifying the rest. Some locals, in fact, responded positively to Whitefield's message because they saw this rebellion and recent epidemics and a recent fire, a number of recent events, as signs of God's disfavor. Others saw Whitefield, who criticized the treatment of enslaved people, as offering an invitation to disorder and even to chaos. The eminent American Jewish historian Jonathan Sarna has argued that the Great Awakening had no influence on early American Jews. I find it somewhat hard to believe, though, that they could have avoided Whitefield or the dramatic debates that he instigated. Whether or not Jews attended these revivals, they certainly would have read about them in the newspapers and heard about them from their neighbors. Beth Elohim, the congregation in Charleston, was founded less than a year and a half after Whitefield's second several-month-long stint in the city. He had written at that time, congregations in Charleston have been greater than ever. That a Jewish congregation joined them may have been not only the natural outcome of a growing Jewish population, as many have described it, but it also might have been a result of this kind of milieu of religious fervor. Oliver's will further suggests that these controversies of the Great Awakening might have influenced or at least encouraged the articulation of popular Jewish theology. Oliver insisted on God's unity, countering Christian Trinitarianism, but his concern with salvation and the nature of the divine, his inclusion of these kind of personal prayers in his will, also echoes concerns that his neighbors engaged in these controversies shared. Whatever the immediate causes, establishing a congregation, entering the Shema prayer into public probate records, were acts of piety that also expressed confidence in Charleston as a place for Jewish life. And indeed, Charleston Jews flourished in the market and on the wharves, where they energetically pursued profit in a robust slave economy. By 1750, 70% of the people in Carolina were enslaved Africans, and Charleston was becoming host to one of the largest slave markets in North America. And Jews, as white settlers, consumed, sold, and otherwise profited from enslaved laborers and the crops they produced. Charleston Jews, because they lived in cities, most likely lived in tight quarters with the people that they enslaved, who would have lacked the opportunities for community and cultural expression available on some large plantations. They may have been able to walk around the city on their own or hire themselves out for work, but this did not mean that these people's lives were free of surveillance, restriction, or cruelty. It's highly unlikely that any enslaved Africans converted to Judaism in this period. For the most part, Atlantic Jews had rejected biblical mandates requiring the circumcision of slaves, with the very notable and interesting exception of Dutch Suriname. Aviva Ben-Or has written a really interesting book about that colony. Beyond that, Charleston Jews were a minority in a colony that was dominated by Protestants, themselves deeply suspicious of slave conversions. Though missionaries might claim that Christianity would improve the behavior of enslaved people, many white Carolinians continued to associate Christianity with freedom and conversion with danger. And of course, even when they could, enslaved people themselves were rarely eager to embrace the religion of their enslavers. Whatever their religious affiliation, however, these enslaved laborers helped Charleston Jews to amass significant prosperity and wealth. To give one example, Beth Elohim was able to honor their deceased religious leader with a large stone box tomb erected sometime after his death, less than a week after Passover in 1762. This would not have been cheap. This is an expensive thing to produce. According to Beth Elohim's earliest history, Moses Cohen was its founding sage and head of a rabbinical court. He did not receive a salary from the congregation and worked as a storekeeper, but he was clearly very beloved. This gravestone is the city's oldest Jewish gravestone, and it features an engraving of two disembodied hands placed in the position assumed during the priestly benediction. So Jews who trace their lineage through the priestly line all the way back to Aaron, they have certain roles in Jewish worship, and one of them is performing the priestly benediction, a particular prayer where their hands appear in this position. These hands are etched onto a backdrop that appears to be a cloth alongside the Hebrew abbreviation for "Here Lies." There's like a little crown at the top, and the Hebrew text for priestly crown. All of that is surrounded by this kind of circular frame that has additional embellishments, which appear to be kind of neatly tied together at the bottom. The text of the gravestone, transcribed here, is written in Hebrew and in English, and begins by situating Cohen in relationship to his priestly lineage, to the Hebrew calendar, and to the biblical text. In Hebrew, he is entitled an accomplished sage, or chacham, using the title given to a scholar or a rabbi in Sephardic communities. And in the English, really, really interestingly, he's described as a right reverend and doctor of divinity. So it's very common in the 17th, 18th, 19th century for Jews in English to call their rabbis and religious leaders reverend, but right reverend doctor of divinity is very specific. Those are honorifics associated with bishops in the Church of England. So this is a very lofty claim. They're putting their religious leader, who also ran a store on the side, they're putting him on the same status as the Bishop of London. There were no bishops in the Americas at this time, so the church, the Anglican Church in Charleston was under the authority of the Bishop of England. So they're saying, our guy, the same as your guy in London. Fascinating. Jewish gravestones typically follow the second commandment prohibition on graven images. So now we're going into a little bit more of the context on the imagery here. The historian Lord Liebman has done a close study of gravestones of Sephardic, Spanish, and Portuguese Jews in the Atlantic world, especially the Caribbean. And she's shown that despite this traditional second commandment prohibition, there was a proliferation of visual imagery in this period on gravestones. Death heads, angels, humans, animals, even depictions of the divine. She argues that these were expressions of mystical beliefs that the physical world was imbued with secret spiritual meaning. And she has worked a little bit on this gravestone from Bridgetown, Barbados. It's the gravestone of a man named Mayor Cohen Belinfante, who died a decade before Moses Cohen. And his gravestone has three parts, the bottom of which includes three images. On the far left is a man blowing a shofar, a ram's horn, as is done in ritual contexts during the high holidays, which just passed last month. In the middle, there's a hand writing with a quill, and on the right are the materials required for a circumcision. So it's showing different kinds of ritual practices that a religious leader would engage in, and that were understood to kind of help initiate the Messianic age. His gravestone is primarily in Hebrew and Portuguese, so it's Portuguese at the top, Hebrew on the bottom, and the only English appears around the edges. Just if you look closely, you can see around the edges, it "Here lieth," and you get some of the basic details. So to compare now with Cohen's gravestone, Moses Cohen's gravestone, he has no Portuguese, and his gravestone is very sparsely decorated. So this suggests to me that, Charleston's Jews certainly maintained the importance of a priestly lineage, but they may have felt more English and perhaps less comfortable with the mystical beliefs that informed the figural depictions we see elsewhere in the Jewish Atlantic world. Indeed, they seem to have followed the local style as much as, if not more so, than the Jewish one. So again here are Cohen's hands and Belinfante's hands. Both of them are positioned delivering the priestly blessing with a crown directly above them. And if you notice that, Mayor Cohen, Belinfante, Moses Cohen, the last name Cohen is associated with this priestly lineage. So they share that priestly lineage. But despite the fact that Belinfante's gravestone has all of this amazing art on it, the hands are actually much simpler than what we see with Moses Cohen in Charleston. Here, this is the only artistic imagery that we have, and it's much more sort of decorative in its depiction. And as it so happens, at the time of Moses Cohen's death, elaborate gravestones were becoming increasingly popular in Charleston. For Anglicans, they expressed a form of Christian faith rooted in reason and in the idea that beauty had the capacity to reveal the divine and reform the soul. And the city's large population of dissenting Protestants had recently initiated a distinctive local trend of erecting what are called portrait gravestones. And when I saw this, it was a very dramatic aha moment in my research. So these kinds of gravestones that we see here on the right are designed to resemble popular miniature portraits that you might keep in your pocket or wear on your lapel. They often included a decorative frame, and they were understood to sort of protect the body buried below it and alleviate fears about its fate. So even as the corpse buried below it was decomposing beyond recognition, the portrait here would remain visibly present, testifying to the politeness and elegance of the deceased person. These gravestones expressed kind of a cosmopolitan taste and encouraged aesthetic unity amongst Charleston elites of multiple religious stripes, right? You could walk around different cemeteries in Charleston, and you can do it to this day, and you see this style with different people in different cemeteries. And I think hopefully you can see the commonalities here with what we see with Moses Cohen, right? They're using this idiom that Charleston Christians also embraced, demonstrating local rootedness, even as, right, the frame looks very similar, the sort of decorative flourishment around it is very similar, and yet it's not the face or the bust that's being highlighted here. It's the hands engaged in this ritual practice. So in a number of ways, Beth Elohim, Oliveira's will, Cohen's gravestone, all of these were made possible by the particularities of Carolina. Jews there were granted many privileges, including access to violent forms of acquiring wealth, and yet they were continually evaluated in relationship to a spectrum of difference built not only on race or skin color, but on religion. Were Jews white dissenting Protestants really? Or were they somehow closer, even just a little bit, to non-white heathens? Living in the midst of this question seems to have perhaps fostered a distinctive religious sensibility. There are signs in what we've seen in the last however many minutes I've been talking about these sources. There are signs of Jewish Atlantic affiliations, of ties to London, the Caribbean, Spanish and Portuguese heritage, but they're hardly overwhelming, and the messianism and mysticism that characterize Jewish life elsewhere seem somewhat oddly absent. In the centuries to follow, a lot would change for Southern Jews. In Charleston, they would eventually, in 1794, build their first synagogue, which you can see here on the left. Oh, the date here is wrong. In 1838, the synagogue burned to the ground, and in 1840, they rebuilt it, and this building still stands in downtown Charleston. It's the second oldest synagogue building extant in the United States. The oldest one is in Newport, Rhode Island, another port city. So a lot did change for Southern Jews, and yet I think much of what was to come was present from the very beginning. Again and again, Jewish migrants arrived in new places in pursuit of stability and prosperity. They navigated local laws and customs, established congregations and families, lived and died, were buried and mourned. The framework of religious freedom that would develop in the United States continued to allow for Jewish worship in some of the ways that we saw in the fundamental constitutions of Carolina. Religion was still defined in relatively narrow terms, and religious freedom still facilitated forms of ongoing Christian dominance. Most European-descended Jews would access citizenship rights and ally with their white neighbors, but the contours of white Southern belonging also shifted in relationship to them, variably expanding and contracting. Even with the significance of a black-white racial binary, racial ideas were never static. Forms of inclusion did not progressively or inevitably expand over time, and Christianity remained pervasive, not only inside churches, revival tents, or individual hearts, outside of politics or government in people's private lives. Christianity remained significant in the structures of public life and in the formation of racialized regional identities. And the lives of Southern Jews bore the marks of this knowledge and the feelings of confidence, ambivalence, and even fear that it could engender. European-descended Jews worked to claim their place within Southern communities as white settlers and as Jews. They persisted in their difference in adverse circumstances, and at times even contested the aspects of the society that they lived in. The most dramatic example of this was actually Sunday closing laws, which were very widespread, well into the 20th century, and were really, really challenging to Jews who observe a Saturday Sabbath in an era before a 2-day work week. When there was only one day off and there were laws preventing work on Sundays, that was hugely difficult for Jews, and so you see Jews getting arrested and going to court and fighting against those laws. At the same time, places can change people in ways both self-conscious and totally invisible. Living in the South left marks on many Jews' everyday practice and their deeply held beliefs about human difference, about the roles of men and women, and about God and the universe. The racial inequality that permeated all aspects of life meant that African-descended people facilitated, usually with little recognition and even less pay, the religious practices of white people, both in individual households and in synagogues, not least by literally helping to build them, as they did in the case of Beth Elohim. And in 2021, that congregation erected a plaque that acknowledges the labor of those enslaved people who literally built their place of worship. At the same time, the region also played an outsized role in the history of American Reform Judaism, a form of kind of modernizing Jewish practice that eliminated many of the barriers standing between middle-class white Jews and non-Jews. All told, Southern Jews were both privileged and vulnerable, political power brokers and targets of hate crimes, religious innovators, and assimilationists. And this was all the case in Mississippi too, where Jewish communities were established in the antebellum era by ambitious peddlers and merchants, where in 1878, a visitor noted, as usual, they have the sway of business and are well off, where there were various efforts to provide education to small-town Jewish youths, where a Northern civil rights lawyer found a group of Mississippi Marranos who privately supported his efforts, but also a Jewish view on segregation was anonymously published, where a progressive rabbi blamed the bombing of his synagogue and home on organizations he described as anti-everything that is not white Protestant native Mississippi. At a time of increasing racial and religious diversity, Southern Jews remind us that even the region of the US seen as the most provincial and isolated has never been uniformly so, despite the fervent wishes, loud proclamations, and violent actions of some of its denizens and leaders. Jews were present in what would come to be known as the South almost from the very, very beginnings of European colonialism, and they helped to define it. Jews, with their global ties and their distinctive God, have been full participants in the creation of this Christ-haunted, black and white, swampy and sticky, diverse and violent region all along. Thank you.